So for the final session of today, we have Joachim Isacsson. Joachim here is Swedish, though he's been resident here in the UK for 9 years, working for our Ministry of Defence at the Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre, or otherwise known as DCDC. Joachim is the co-lead for the Global Strategic Trends Programme, which produces an extraordinary document quite regularly that I would highly recommend, that looks into the future and how security in the broadest sense of the term can be interpreted. Joachim's going to be talking a bit about that and a bit about the context in which he's working. Joachim, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to say something this event. I must say, I mean, as a Swede, you're always humbled by design, but I'm even more humbled by being in this knowledgeable audience and contribute to all the interesting discussions we're having today. And my first effort was to try to think about the catchy name for the presentation and so on. And really the reason why I chose Tomorrow Never Dies is I remember Lord Rees, I listened to a presentation he had in Brussels once where he talked about that it is easy to see the future as a distant colony where you dump all the problems you have today for next generations to solve, and all well and good. And at DCDC, we always say it's completely meaningless to look at the future, even try to understand it, if you don't try to bring it back to you and ask yourself, what do we need to do today to influence the future into something we want it to be and to shape it? And if you can't shape it, how do we adapt to it? So the future starts today, so that is very much behind that one. And I thought of using our ongoing work with the next version of the Global Strategic Trends to put some context to crisis and change. And the next version, it will be the 7th now. We hope to publish it next year. It will be 20 years since we did the first one. It's meant to support the government's broader integrated security review and look at what the future may look like and how we best protect the British people, basically. So even if I work for defense, it's really not about aeroplanes, ships and tanks and so on. It's really about the broader security. But coming into the topic here, and I think when you look at the future and look at change, discontinuity is an integral part of it, whether you like it or not. It's just how the world works. And discontinuities are things we call, could be trend drivers that cause disruptions, that cause an ongoing trend to take a new direction and change. And these changes often happen in an unexpected way because of all the complex interactions here, because it will never be one single thing causing that change. It will happen in interaction with other drivers. And we often use what we call a kind of a future zoo to illustrate various discontinuities. The black swan already been mentioned by Luke today. It's, if it is a really black swan, you can't catch it. It is something that we haven't observed before, something with high impact, very difficult to predict. So obviously, if you can predict it, it's not likely to really be a black swan. The other two, the jellyfishes and the black elephants, are really more interesting and more of an issue. The black jellyfish is an expression of something we think we are aware of. We have full knowledge about this thing, and yet unexpected outcomes can come for it. A long tail of the jellyfish may sting you. And the black elephant is things we are fully aware of, that we, for all kind of reason, don't consider or act properly to solve. And Einstein here illustrates the issue that you can't solve the future's problem with the same mindset you had when you created the problems themselves. So if we look at strategic shocks, that we call it in the military, bolts from the blue, of course, you may argue that we already heard one presenter saying that 9/11 could be predicted, and of course, Pearl Harbor, in hindsight, there was probably people saying that could have been predicted as well, but it wasn't predicted by those sitting in the White House as such, and it wasn't expected by the majority, the absolute majority of the American population. So then it is a strategic shock, even if one or two people may have seen that something would happen because of the build-up. And perceptions is really important because that decides the mindset of an entity and those who lead that entity. And the doom and gloom asteroid here, 1 of a million, I've learned today, I put there just because I had this comedy, Don't Look Up, in mind, where you could actually see this thing coming towards Earth, and there was all kind of problems and so on to discuss and find a way to solve it, which is inherent in the problem set in itself. And that leads me to the future's dilemma we need to be aware of when we try to understand the future. The problem is that you can't go to the library, get the book and read about the future in a very evidence way, because it hasn't happened yet. When we are standing in the present, we are standing at the edge of our knowledge, and everything ahead of us is some sort of uncertainty, and that uncertainty increases the further ahead you look. And the way we human works, by instinct, when we are not fully aware of something, we haven't experienced it, we build a sort of reality with images we see, and those images will very often be more the same with a bit of a futuristic outlook, and they will also be influenced by things we repeatedly hear and see. And herein lays a challenge in itself, and that is linear thinking and groupthink, which are really major challenges, not only in how we understand the future, but in policy making. And that is the thing we try to work with. And the final challenge is also a kind of a feeling that if we can't predict the future, which I strongly believe we can't, regardless of what method you use, we humans are way too unpredictable to do that. Many people would say, why even bother? Why even bother trying? And then on the other hand, you have the other extreme, people saying there's a technological solution to every single problem we have in the world. Don't worry about it. And of course, I think you need to look at something in between. Yes, you can't predict, but of course you can understand what drives the future, and that's important. But when you try to do that, you have the final challenge is that everything you see, everything you look at through your own lens and your own biases and so on, which makes it incredibly important to try to look as a group and so on. And we had some really good presentations today about the importance of that to complement your own and challenge your own biases. So of course, when this event happens here in the implausible part, it will be very difficult to foresee how it would happen. And if we look at creeping crises, like Martin Rees called slow-moving crises, they are really, I think, the important one to look at, but they're also incredibly difficult. Illustrating, I think Alexis de Tocqueville's quote about the French Revolution is a good one, because it built up under many decades. Was absolutely obvious that the population was incredibly fed up with all the injustices and so on it was facing. Food crisis and all kind of other crises were building up, but they were looked at separately. And then the tipping point came, and the world was shocked. And we have had so many of these events as such. And I just collected a couple of others we are looking at on the red explosions here. I won't go through them in detail. You probably recognize a number of them. But the thing is, there is major challenges to academics and strategic foresight analysis when it comes to creeping crisis, because it's just difficult to define them and delineate them from other social phenomena. And what is exactly the crisis? And if you need more than a couple of minutes when you try to explain to a policymaker, you're already on shaky water. So the other issue is that they are incredibly hard to manage, but very easy to ignore. And they have a long incubation phases and a lifespan, and the causes may be uncertain even after the crisis and with benefit from hindsight. And the thing is also that the tipping point may not necessarily lead to an eruption after which the crisis fades away slowly. It may continue to creep and produce another big crisis. And the constant issue is how to generate urgency. And I think that's a commonality in all the presentations we've had today. There's been that issue. How do you create an urgency around these kind of issues? Does it need to happen first? And how badly does it need to happen before it becomes something? And that is part of the definition, the absence of attention. And I think the real crisis is when a series of cascading crises start to happen, and we see an eruption eroding trust in the government and institutions that were meant to detect, prevent, and manage those crises. And one of the efforts in the global trends is really to put those crises into context and look at how can we adapt and what can we do today when it comes to the management. And the first step is really very basic. It is everyone that talked about methods for foresight and so on has been into this field. It is to understand how and why is the world changing and what is driving that change, because the drivers of that change will also be part of the creeping crisis. And to do that, just as been mentioned today, you need some sort of system model that is not overly complicated, because then it will be difficult to explain how the evidence is built up. Because the constant problem you have when you try to talk about the future with the policymaker, regardless of where you are in the world, is the question, why should I believe you? You're coming up with very difficult choices here. What's your evidence? And our system looks at the human civilization in 3 pillars. Us humans in society, who we are, how old we are, what we want to be, ambitions, how we organize ourselves, and all that kind of thing. Economy is the other one, and the economy pillar produces the things we humans want, and the environment is the real world around us and the climate where we find the resources, and that is tied together by information and technology. And using that system, we try to understand if this thing happened in this part of the system, how might it influence other parts of the system, and the system is not living its own life. What's really important is to find the engine in the system. Who is influential? Who's pushing it? How could that be different tomorrow compared to today? And where is Britain in that picture? And where's the influence coming from? And a key thing is today the state is an essential framework in international relations and in handling crises and so on. And will the state still have that role in the future? What strengthens the state, and what are the sources for the power of the state and what are the sources that undermine the state is things we try to understand. And very important part of international relations is levels of competition and cooperation, and how can it go in different directions, because that influences how we see crises, how we deal with them, and so on. And the key word is always trust. People came up, I thought they were incredibly useful, the comedy things here, because they really pointed at essential things in this. And the drivers, I'm sure you can recognize. And what's important with the drivers, that you can't look at them in isolation. They are all interlinked. So the system in itself won't give you the full picture of the context for this crisis. So it's important to complement the system analysis with scenarios for how the world may look. And we are using really two axes, coming back whether we have strong states and weak states, competition and cooperation. And that gives us 4 contextual worlds that, of course, are highly theoretical, because you will have a mix of those worlds in the real world. But you could see worlds with a higher level of diffusion of power, competition, and so on. And it's also important to understand that coming back to the only thing we know about the future is not going to be linear. So the future won't be, in the longer term, that scenario, or that scenario. It's more likely to be a sequence of something, perhaps a direction that leads to a fragmented world, a massive war, then leads to a more cooperative and so on, like it have done in history. But hopefully there are also other ways. So I think it's really important coming back to the drivers that may push in one direction or another. And backcasting was mentioned here as a tool to look at the path to these worlds. And one of the key uncertainties and potentially the biggest creeping crisis that could end our human civilization beside climate change is the competition between the 2 great powers today, China and US. What will be the outcome? Will it lead to an accommodation where we see a new multilateral order as a result of that? Will it continue for a very long time as a managed competition, or will it lead to a devastating war? And it's really interesting when you look at what would drive cooperation versus competition. It very much comes back to the same thing, the creeping crisis. Should we handle them as a collective? Do we have the trust? Can we create a mutual benefit for everybody, a common good, by dealing with it through international institutions? Or do we not trust each other enough? Will I have a better advantage by thinking of myself first and using my technology for my nation, for my power block, and make sure that we are not lagging behind the others in a hard competition? And that trust is incredibly difficult to create. Today, I think we have a plurilateral world with pockets of cooperation, high level of cooperation in different parts of the world, and a world that is becoming more and more divided. So one way of supporting our policymakers, people making decisions on government level, working with uncertainty, and that's a difficult one. I can tell you one thing. You can't. It takes about 3 years to produce the global trends, and to come after 3 years. Look, I have a 1 kilo heavy publication here. Just read it, and you have all the answer to all your questions. And I would say enormously interesting. Put it on the desk, and there it will be collecting dust for decades. So the process of involving those who are going to use the information must be a continuous process where you constantly have a constant interaction, not having the customer telling you what to write, because then your analysis become politicized, and there's nothing good in that. It needs to be challenging, but it needs to be understood, and you need to have a buy-in. So the way we try to do that is to present parts of the analysis and then ask people what they see the key implications are. And this particular exercise, which actually we had 70 people or so in the British government taking part in an event in British Council one day, where we presented all the trends and so on. And then we asked them to start thinking about what kind of uncertainties would have the highest impact and are connected also to the highest degree of uncertainty. And of course, artificial intelligence come up directly up in the corner, because it's always does, because it is, I think today it was a very good example of that also with, will we one day reach a point where we can be completely replaced as human or not? And you can't say today that that's not going to happen, and that's quite a big one. But you can also see another danger in this, number 10, that's climate change. Everybody say, yep, high impact, and that one is parked there. Not much uncertainty with that one. And that becomes the furniture in the room, so you constantly need to make your customer, the people you work for, aware that the uncertainty bubble may actually be quite bigger in reality. But anyway, when we did this exercise, we used this to commission extra research, extra work, and so on. And we're just about to start the next phase and renew this one, which was produced for the version of Global City Trends we produced 2018. But then sometimes it's good to think like a child. Ask those questions, but then, Daddy, but what if that happens? After that, if that happens, what will then happen? And it's a really useful exercise because it would force you to think about all the uncomfortable things that you didn't want to in the beginning. I mean, imagine if we would have taken that seriously. What if Russia actually invades Ukraine in a very brutal way before they actually did it? Because nobody thought they would do such a counterproductive, horrible thing as such, because that's not what you do, is it? And the what if you can extend to a number of such things. I'm using European Union Institute for Strategic Studies, which you have a very close cooperation with, that publish such a publication every year. So challenge is enormously important. And we're quite fortunate in DCDC. We have a good budget that allows us to travel around the world and have these kind of discussions with different cultures and so on. And it's absolutely essential. Otherwise, it would be a European way of looking at the world with all those limitations. And there are many more methods to approach this. But when we're coming back to resilience, adaptability, it will always come back to the human dimension. And on the photo is my son. He was 7 years. The most important day for any parent in Britain, Sports Day. And yeah, you can almost hear the music of Evangelis to Chariot of Fire there in the background. He actually won the race. I can't tell you how proud I am. But I'm just choosing him on the photo because it starts there. It starts in that age when you shape a society and how strong it is, how adaptable it is, and the level of resilience. And even if I normally wear uniform, I always say that the pillar foundation for all security, resilience, always come back to education. It is in that age you learn to see the world through the lens of us and us, or us and them. It is in that age you learn that you get away with bullish behavior, or you get rewarded for standing up for someone that is weaker than yourself, and that honesty is rewarded. It is in that age you learn, you get encouraged for creativity, critical thinking, or you learn that you better stay in the box and not being difficult. It is in that age you learn whether you are valued for your personal merits or because of your parents, the color of your skins, your gender, and it's in that age, depending on which one of those two, you learn to trust your teachers, and in prolongation of that, the institutions of a state and so on. And that is really important. And then, of course, the continuation of the very basic education, which in our analysis, talks about lifelong learning. It's where you provide the skills, which you are all part of, that give a society agility, capacity, the knowledge to deal with crisis. And if that doesn't work, nothing else will work either. And critical thinking is massively important, and it's a strength of our democratic societies, even if we constantly have this self-whipping, I'm lost the word in English, authoritarian state rises, they are more effective and so on. I just don't believe in that. Without critical thinking and the fact that all power corrupts, you will have several weaknesses in how you deal with these things. Not everything is better because it's mechanistic and you can do what you want. The intellectual dimension is absolutely essential. And trust and values, I mean, what a massive difference whether you trust your state or not when it comes to a crisis. Will I do as I'm told, or will I not, because I'm not listening, I'm not paying tax anyway, so because those money will just go away to someone's pocket or something, or they will be for something better good. So the trust and values is there, and then culture, behavior, of course. And I think when we look critically to our methods, been mentioned a number of times today, you constantly need to review the culture a risk assessment is done in. Is it updated? Is it modern? Is it meeting new requirements? And are we doing the risk assessments in a way that they meet requirements for digital age and so on? And there will always be new age. It never stops. So every time, every year, you will go, every time in history, they would always have said that these extraordinary times we're living in, because that's how change is. And to end my presentation, a good question is, what will the basics look like tomorrow? Will all kind of human augmentations and enhancements and so on? And the only thing we know is that either it will be very successful and we will continue to live on, or we fail and we will not. And that ends my presentation.
So, time for questions, and I have one in front of me, which is from David Wood, which is you had up on there an image of the black jellyfish and the black elephant. Would you give examples of what you mean by the black jellyfish and the black elephant?
I think black jellyfish is something you think you're fully aware of, and Pearl Harbor could be an example of a black jellyfish. US thought they had a working policy against an expansionist Japan in World War II, and with more sanctions and so on, they were locking them into the box, and that would have theoretically worked because Japan was very rapidly running out of oil. What they didn't expect was that in Tokyo, they said, okay, we're running out of oil. What are we doing about it before it's too late? And that was a sting from the jellyfish. I think climate change is the obvious black elephant. We are absolutely aware of it. The train has left the station. It's happening, and it's going to be very difficult to deal with it. And yet, there is so many excuses for not doing everything we say we are doing at conferences and so on.
Thank you. We've got a question from Anders. And then from Partha, yeah.
Thank you, great talk. So there are many examples of fantastic individuals that have amazing resilience and adaptivity that inspires us, but usually they're fairly unique. On the other hand, education, health and wealth generally tends to build resiliency or resilient people on a mass scale. Are there other ways we might be able to improve individual resilience and adaptivity at scale across our societies?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I think if we leave education and the learning environment and health and so on, which is really important, it comes back to one of the biggest creeping crisis I think we have is social fragmentation in our societies and so on. And that is probably a more severe crisis than the geopolitics of the day, if I say so, if you look at it in the long term. And give people a purpose. So we've been talking about artificial intelligence today and so on. We've been really focusing on the existential risk of it, how it will take over and get rid of us all. But my question would rather be, because it's not going to go away, is it? So how do we build societies where humans still have a purpose and still benefit from those technologies? And if we can't, the resilience will go down because you will have enormous inequality of those who benefit from that high-tech society and the others that don't. So I think technology is really agnostic. It's not a living thing yet, and it can be used for bad and good. It is used for bad and good, but we need to think about how we're using it for good and how you build fair society. I mean, a level of fairness that is generally accepted. There's no society in the world that's completely equal, but a level that is generally accepted. And to do that, I think we need a state. I don't think the private sector is able to deliver that kind of fairness. Of course, I'm working for state, but that's personally what I absolutely think. Wealth distribution and so on, will the private sector do that without pressure, for example?
I don't work for the state, and I agree with you. Partha.
Your earlier slides, you had these bubbles of pressure points, let's say on the biosphere and therefore on us. And one can see, obviously, they're interconnected, each influences the other and so forth. But nevertheless, good science suggests that we ought to dig deeper than simply say they relate to each other and see which might be a more primal cause. So, I mean, a good deal of attention is given to climate change. But of course, that's an effect. It's an outcome of many things. And one of the many things was one of your bubbles was population pressure. And yet, I don't see any discussion of that in either government, and I've had some dealings with the government, UK government recently, or anywhere else, for that matter. Why do you think that's the case?
I mean, I shouldn't be here defending myself by instinct, but it might not be the most urgent issue, but I think in our analysis it is still in the forefront. We are looking at what does it mean with an aging population, what does end of population growth mean when, if you look at our societies and our economies, always built on progressive population growth that's been driving economic growth by more people, more consumers, and so on, and that's going to end everywhere in the world at the 2060 or something, even in Africa. So I think we are looking at what is the alternative to today's economic models and so on. And then, of course, you have the aging with, if we take East Asia, I think the median age will be 47 or 48, 2050. How will they continue to be competitive and so on? And Japan already said it's not a problem for us. We'll just replace humans with robots, and it's working. It's not that easy in other places. And then you have a different population pressure in Africa, where you still have a very rapid population growth. I think it's another 1 billion people, a doubling of the entire population in the coming 3 decades, which means more demand for resources and so on. And that's, of course, driving all kind of second and third order effects. I would say that aging populations and population pressure in very vulnerable areas are there.
No, I think the driver behind my question was the effect on the biosphere of human numbers. And you pointed to the African case, which is extremely worrying for Africans, because of their local ecosystems. And yet the UK government, of which you're a part, reduced its aid budget for family planning and reproductive health in Africa to nearly zero. Only it's in the last budget. That's the reason for my asking. Why?
Okay.
I mean, in some sense, it's a sort of after-dinner thought. But deep down at the decision-making level, I see no place of demographic pressures, future pressures, which are becoming unfolding.
I mean, it's difficult for me to comment on with being on YouTube and all that. But I don't know how many governments in the West actually increased their aid budgets and so on after the pandemic and the crisis you have home and so on. So I guess it's coming back to that. I don't think there is a less understanding of the implications, all kind of second-order effects like migration and so on, and instability and all that comes from the issue. It's current resource and prioritization issue.
Thank you. After dinner comments are very welcome before dinner. Can I go to Angela next and then Luke?
Thank you. I found it very interesting because you brought this quote by Alexis de Tocqueville about, what did it say exactly? I mean, it was not so foreseeable, and yet, it was so surprising. And I found it interesting because you also mentioned 3 other examples, but we've seen one that is very recent, and that's the Ukraine. We've seen absolutely the build-up, everyone is known, and, you being from the military also, I remember that there used to be all of these war games and scenario planning, etc. And, here we're talking about global existential risk, but we're also talking about risk in general. So my question is really like, how come that not more is being done? I mean, it's not like it's something novel, that something will occur, but we can actually foresee it, we can see it building up, and yet we're all surprised all of a sudden when it does happen.
I mean, if I should be fair, both the American and the British intelligence services were crystal clear with it. It's going to happen. But again, and I can only speak for myself at this point, and I'm Swede, I've studied Russia for decades and so on, and I still thought it would end up in a different way. I wouldn't expect this would happen because just as it is happening, it's just making Russia weaker, they're losing it, and the costs are enormous. So I think it comes back to that, maybe because you look at the Russians through the lens of your own biases or not properly understanding Putin. But I think it is not even the Chinese probably thought it would take this kind of event as it has. And it is an enormous mistake Putin has done. It's no doubts about it. And in one way or another, he will lose it.
Cool, thank you for the presentation. Resilience is often referred to in a very positive manner, but ultimately it's a neutral characteristic. Autocracies can be quite resilient. Empire is arguably one of the most resilient forms of political organization. How do we know what systems we want to keep resilient and which ones we want to be fragile?
Can I just intervene there and give another question that is almost identical and follows it up, which is from David Wood. And he says, Joachim gave reasons for preferring the tolerance of critical thinking over closed-mindedness of autocracies. But is there a risk that too much criticism within society will become toxic and will prevent unpleasant but unnecessary decisions being taken? Which is kind of related.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's always good to look at, if you look at an entity formed by people and so on, you need to look at it as a sociologist. What are the things that culturally keep people together, regardless of the difference you have in classes in society and so on. And I think some of those fundamentals, it's not just about the political system. If you look at China, it's more than just the party and so on. When it comes to resilience, it's the way of accepting authority. You're doing as you're told, as not just because it's an authoritarian state, but it's a kind of a cultural kind of thing. And then, of course, a political model comes on top of that. So I would seek the answer to that question first by looking at the entity from a sociological point of view, culture, behavior, and how that's influenced in general. And then, of course, polarization of politics is one of the biggest challenges in the Western world today. And it's not gone away because of the unity we see now, because of the Ukraine crisis, all the issues that we have with inequality, being part of something and so on. is still there, and something that any state in Europe will have to take very seriously. And I always say, as an officer, it's a difference between just complaining and constructive challenge and criticism that leads to an action that is providing good. So, of course, just having a couple of million people whinging about everything, it wouldn't be the best example of resilience, probably.
David.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the talk. Could you share any thoughts about U.S.-China collaboration? Like you sort of alluded to the possibility of a future world in which we have a sort of bipolar, bilateral world order, and I guess that has always seemed like, that would be really nice, but maybe somewhat implausible, or I guess I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that, what it might look like, what might facilitate it, yeah, anything along those lines.
I think it depends very much on personal leadership, these kind of things. Such a thing, as we look back in history, always need to start because of personal initiative by two leaders that in one way or another built up a combination of trust and a common win-win if they find that way. And then, of course, two leaders contact in isolation because you have your national institutions, parliaments, Congress, your politics, and Xi Jinping is not running China on his own. He has the party and a collective kind of leadership, even if he's chairman and so on. So I think one potential scenario is that as China gain more strength, we just may get used to it in a way that we've done with other powers that have taken the same path in history, and at some point China see a benefit in the party sees a benefit in staying in power by and delivering prosperity by being less confrontational, aggressive, and still getting the gains from that, more ready to compromise. That could be one possibility. Another possibility, again, showing the unpredictability here, already coming back to while China is an authoritarian state, and we will see a more slow change of leadership, who's president in US 2024 and 2028 and so on. And you may even see in America that in its own choice becomes more inward looking and so on, and accommodation within that framework. I still think it lays way ahead of us as it looks today. The competition is very high, but China is very different from Russia. It still have a lot at stake, and the party is not strong enough to stay in power purely by repression. They are very, very well aware that they need to deliver prosperity, otherwise it won't be possible. And prosperity, again, is dependent on trade and a more interconnected world. Maybe there can be different versions in that. It could be a major Asian bloc that is big enough to deliver that prosperity still in a multipolar world. So there's many varieties there. And what I always say, and something we're putting a lot of emphasis on in the current version of Global Trends, is that the world is more than US and China. And you actually have quite a few important middle powers, Britain one of them, South Korea another one. We just don't think about it, but if you see more cooperation between powers that don't want to be squished in between the great powers. Let's just say, for example, we had that discussion in a previous engagement in Asia, and the Koreans said themselves, we need to leave history behind us, and we need to look forward and look for new opportunities. And ask the question, would you be ready to cooperate with Japan, for example? That would be a very powerful bloc, both economically and militarily and so on. Yeah, it might be time for that now. So things are changing, and we tend to forget these kind of choices. What will India be in the future? What kind of future will they see best for themselves? Will it be the same as today or something else? And already combination of some powers could create alternatives. So, and then you have all the non-state actors that are increasingly powerful and so on, also in quite a complex picture. So it's important that the world is more than China and US.
I have a question at the back there.
Thank you. How much do you believe the fashionable phrase of the fish rots from the head, and that it's all a problem of governance in governments in order to resolve these problems, and that the people are powerless to do anything about it? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I just wanted to have your view, because there's also the matter of the UN as well, the Security Council.
I mean, a multilateral institution will never be stronger than the cohesion of its members. So if that gets politicized, of course it will be less effective. But one argument I often hear, and I actually believe in, is UN is more than the Security Council. And there's quite a few UN agencies that still, despite the polarization of politics, manage to achieve quite extraordinary achievements in poverty reduction and all these kind of things. So it's not completely black and white, but it comes back to the trust. And today, that wouldn't be on a very high level if it comes to the standing members, for example. When it comes to ordinary people and so on, I always use the argument when we are presenting in various parts of the world where transparency is not the same. Global strategic trends is completely unclassified. It's out there for everyone to read. We ask academics, we involve young people, we want their views, and we want to have the involvement of society because they're going to live in the society. We are trying to understand how it will look in the future. So that's enormously important to get a robust, credible product that actually can inform politics in a much more credible way if that's been taken into account, I would say.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question. Many of us try our best to engage with policymakers and government decision makers. And my question to you was going to be, how do you sleep at night, given what you look at? But my question is, why is it that the people that you work with, and I don't mean in DC, but I mean ministers, I mean uniformed officers in MOD and others, why is it that they do sleep at night? Or another way of putting it is, why don't they listen to you?
I mean, I think a lot of people listen to us, and it's just, if you look at change in a government department like defense, where you have investments in the size of billions and so on, and you wouldn't just, okay, Joachim said we don't need that anymore, so we're going to scrap all that and we're going to do this instead. It's not working like that. It's change takes time in when you're looking at change in these dimensions. But I still think you can see a good example of change happening, even if it's helped by crisis and so on. And something I'm impressed by as a Swede when you work in the British government is how integrated it is in many ways. You work in common working groups. If you discuss security, there will be someone from the Department of Health in that discussion. There will be someone from the Department of Education. There will be someone from Department of Culture, Culture and Media and Sport, and so on. And there's a lot of things that is done really well and could serve as an example for others in the British government, I would say. And I'm saying that as a Swede, so I hope that gives some credibility to it.
Thank you. I think it leaves me to say thank you very much indeed for an excellent keynote speech. And beyond that, thank you for the work you do at DCDC. It's inspiring to see that sort of forward-looking and it's not always, whatever you say, it's not always reflected in other parts of government. So thank you very much indeed. So let's just...